St Maroun and his disciples. St Maroun is a rather well-known saint on account of the Maronites. The Maronites, the only church, Cyrrhus church, or the Catholic church, that is named after a particular saint. But the lives of his disciples are more or less unheard of, even among Maronites. Even the life of St Maroun particularly isn't as well known as you would think it is. We know that St Maroun was an early church monastic from Antioch, that he was somehow within the region of Syria/Lebanon, and that he had some degree of prominence as a monastic. But the particulars of his life, and the particulars more especially of the lives of his disciples, are often totally unknown to both Maronites and non-Maronite Catholics. To go and to delve into the life of St Maroun and his disciples, we do need to begin with a bit of a geography/history/biographical introduction to certain features of the church in Antioch before we can really contextualize who St Maroun is, how we know about St Maroun, and what we know about his disciples. So, to begin with, we will start with Antioch. St Maroun is from Antioch. Now, Antioch is the capital city of what was originally the Seleucid Empire. So the Seleucid Empire was one of the four empires that were formed after the death of Alexander the Great. And Antioch was established as the capital of the Seleucid Empire. Now, this empire extended from what would be today modern-day South Turkey through Syria and modern-day Lebanon. Now, the city of Antioch is today referred to as Antakya, which is in modern-day Turkey. The see of Antioch was a West Syriac rite. In other words, they celebrated the liturgy of St. James. There are various prominent theological schools within Antioch, namely and more prominently Antioch, Edessa, and Nisibis. See, the See of Antioch also extended close to, and if not overlapping with, the Persian Empire in the east. Antioch is first mentioned in the Gospels, or more specifically, to say the least, in the book of Acts, where we hear of disciples in Antioch for the first time referring to themselves as Christians. St. Paul and Barnabas go to minister to these people, and then St. Peter goes and is eventually referred to throughout the tradition as the first bishop of Antioch. Antioch consisted of what is today, at least, modern-day Syria, and what would be seen as, at the time, the Roman province of Syria. Okay, so the See of Antioch overlapped with what is called the modern-day province of Syria, which extended again into South Turkey and included Lebanon. Lebanon at this time was a mountain, Mount Lebanon. Okay, the cedars of Lebanon referred throughout Scripture refer to the cedars that grew on the mountains in the southernest regions of what was eventually called Roman Syria. Roman Syria was established when Pompey the Great invaded the Seleucid Empire and incorporated it into the Roman Empire. Now, the main people that lived in these regions, at least in the south of Turkey, see, most of Antioch and Roman Syria consisted of what we call Syriac peoples. Okay, the Syriac dialect is the dialect of Aramaic that Aramaic is the dialect of Syriac that our Lord spoke. Now, Syriac and the Syriac people there became and formed what was the Syriac Rite of Antioch. In Lebanon, we would have what is called the Phoenicians. Now, the Phoenicians are the Canaanite people. And the Phoenicians are synonymous with that group of people The term is more or less interchangeable. And they had city-state rule along what would be the coastal side of Lebanon and Syria. Most specifically, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos. And these people established city-state colonies across the Mediterranean, the most famous of which is in North Africa, which is the great city of Carthage, which almost destroyed Rome itself. And so these Phoenician people established colonies in South Europe, including Spain and Portugal, which is why some Spanish people today are going to claim some type of Phoenician ancestry mixed in with their people. Lebanese people today, specifically Maronites, like to identify themselves with the Phoenician people. Well, what relevance is this? Well, this forms a context of the geographical and demographic reality of Roman Syria at the time when I'm going to introduce St Maroun. But before we do that, it's useful to actually have a bit of a bigger picture of how the Christian empire looked. I know I use this quite often in my videos and my talks, but just as a quick recap, what we have here is an image of the Roman Empire colored in according to the patriarchal jurisdictions of the various patriarchs. The western half of the Roman Empire, known as the Latin West, is obviously all shaded in red as the patriarchate of the Bishop of Rome. The second most prominent bishop was that of Alexandria, who in this diagram is in the orange in the bottom right. Now, Alexandria was the famous port city in North Egypt, established by no other, or named after at least, the great Alexander the Great. The third most prominent and prestigious see, at least as acknowledged by the First Ecumenical Council before revisions put Constantinople as second, the third most prominent see was that of Antioch, again established by Peter, then Jerusalem, and then Constantinople. Eventually, Constantinople will be elevated by the councils. It's a debate as to whether or not Canon 28 had or was accepted and recognized by who and when by who, but that's irrelevant to this video. What is relevant to this video is to understand that Antioch, where the patriarchate in which St Maroun originated from, was the third most prominent see in the church. Now, why was it the third most prominent see? I said it was Rome, Alexandria, and then Antioch. Well, it's because St. Peter was first at Antioch, and then St. Peter asked his disciple, the Blessed Mark, to go to Alexandria, and then after that, St. Peter went from Antioch to Rome. And so what we see is that the reason that it was Rome, Alexandria, and then Antioch is because of the reverse order at which it was established either by Peter himself or Peter's directive. And so we see this triune Petrine ecclesiology. Obviously, the fullness of St. Peter's prerogatives is in the Bishop of Rome. But according to the teachings of Leo the Great, there is this symbolic and full unity of the Petrine episcopal nature. Now, all bishops have a Petrine character, but in a more particular sense, the bishops of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch are spoken of as successors of Peter. And then in the most specific sense, Rome is spoken of as the successor of Peter, not merely in episcopal continuity, in that, like, which can be claimed by Antioch too. St. Peter was there, then he appointed a successor, and then so on and so forth. But it's also a successorship of the prerogatives of the Blessed Peter. So that's the unique sense in which Peter, the Bishop of Rome, is a successor of St. Peter. All bishops, broadly speaking, are. More particularly are the three bishops of Rome, Alexandria, then Antioch, and the most specifically is Rome. Okay, so that's your geographical context of Christianity more broadly. More specifically, we're going to have a look at how Roman Syria looked. See, what we have here in the south, you see what would be modern-day Israel/Palestine, and Rome called that Palestina. So Rome gave the name Palestine. Okay. What we see in the south is what is mentioned there as kind of Phoenicia / Lebanon. You see Tyre and Caesarea, Sidon. But going up further, what we see is more specifically modern-day Syria and Antioch, which I've just kind of noted there. It's in the bold, is towards the north of Syria. Now, today we're going to be focusing on St Maroun and his disciples. Now, St Maroun, according to most historians, not all, but most historians, was born in the city of Cyrrhus. At least, whether he was born there or not, we know that he was the sole responsible individual for the flourishing of monastics in the city of Cyrrhus. Now, Cyrrhus there is noted as not too far away from Antioch. So we can see that St Maroun is rather close to Antioch there. Our Maronites are also quite aware of St Ephrem, who died in Edessa, which we can see is a bit more further away from Cyrrhus than Antioch was. So I mentioned earlier there were the theological schools of Antioch, Edessa, Nisibis. Nisibis is quite literally on the border of Persia and Rome, and that's why St Ephrem ends up migrating to Edessa, because the Roman Empire, in organizing a peace treaty with the Persians, offered up Nisibis as a city to the Persians and promised that the Christians would all be expelled. So they were expelled, and he moved more inwards, more towards the coast, to Edessa. So there's a general sense of geographically where is St Maroun operating. So here, up in Cyrrhus, not too far from Antioch, okay? And also not that far away from Edessa. Now, the last bit of introductory material that will be useful, at least for your appreciation of the talk, is going to be of Theodoret of Cyrus. Now, Theodoret of Cyrus, or Cyrrhus, is, as we just mentioned for St Maroun, from, or the bishop at least, of the diocese of Cyrrhus. Now, that was the diocese, again, where St Maroun was born. So what we see is that Theodoret of Cyrus is going to be our source of history for St Maroun and his disciples. So who is Theodoret of Cyrus or Cyrrhus? Well, he was a monk at the monastery of Nikert. He was the bishop of Cyrrhus from the year 423 to 458 AD. Okay? He was considered, more broadly speaking, a part of the Antiochian school of theology. He is a prominent biblical commentator and ecclesiastical historian. At least as Catholics, that's where we can derive some value from him. Now, Theodoret of Cyrus was a personal friend of the Syrian monks. He's our only source of St Maroun. We have one other historical document that makes mention, very likely, of our blessed Maroun, but Theodoret of Cyrus is the only one who actually recounts a history of St Maroun. Now, he has a writing called the Religious Histories. And in chapter 16 of the Religious History, he gives a recount of the Syrian monks. Now, in this, he goes through about 30 or so monks, most of whom are pretty contemporary to him. He begins with the famous Jacob of Nisibis. So Jacob of Nisibis is St Ephrem's bishop. Okay, remember, St Ephrem started in Nisibis before dying in Edessa. St Jacob lived during the time when there were borders disputes between Persia and Rome, but he died before the exile happened. Now, St Jacob of Nisibis is quite a famous early church bishop. He attended the First Ecumenical Council at Nicaea. He had prominence as the bishop of the great St Ephrem, doctor of the church. And so he's a quite prominent person, but Theodoret begins with him as the first monk who he's recalling, but St Jacob of Nisibis at this time had died. So Theodoret begins recalling the lives of people who had died, and he's recalling the stories that already existed of them, even though, they were only dead a couple of generations. As we move through, we go through more and more monks until eventually we arrive to monks who died rather recently. And Theodoret of Cyrus is talking about them and recounting first-hand stories he has from people who knew them personally. So the historical accuracy starts to significantly increase. And then towards the last third or 40% of the book, we're talking about monks who are still alive, who Theodoret have met personally, and he's attesting to this information personally. Now, there are some crazy stories that Theodoret of Cyrus is going to tell in his religious histories. And he's aware of that. He's aware of the stories of I think, lions bringing a monk bread and raising people from the dead and, cursing women so their hair turns white. Some of these, like the last example, which he attributes to St. Jacob of Nisibis, most people are going to say, that's probably a bit of legend creeping into the story. But towards the end, he starts actually testifying to these things personally. And he even stops to acknowledge and say, I know that some of these stories are a bit fanciful, but I've seen it myself, or I've met people who testify to it, and nothing is impossible without the grace of God. And so Theodoret truly is a witness to a flourishing of monasticism during this period of time. And he is aware of the miracles and the glory that's being worked. So before we jump in, I'd like to say a couple of more things about Theodoret of Cyrus. Theodoret of Cyrus, to anyone who's a child, or not a child, a student of history, I should say, is someone who's not uncommon of a name, let's say. You would have heard of Theodoret of Cyrus if you have a particular interest in ecclesiastical early church history. I just said ecclesiastical church history. If you have an interest in early ecclesiastical history. And that's because Theodoret of Cyrus has his prominence around the third and fourth ecumenical council. You notice how I'm saying Theodoret of Cyrus and not Saint Theodoret of Cyrus. And that's because when the famous St. Cyril of Alexandria went to theological war against the Patriarch of Constantinople, or the Archbishop at the time of Constantinople, Nestorius, the Patriarch of Alexandria, St. Cyril, found himself not just an enemy with Nestorius, but also an enemy of Theodoret of Cyrus, this Antiochian bishop, not of Antioch, but of a city near Antioch. Now, Theodoret of Cyrus was interesting. He's going to be called a Nestorian by modern-day Miaphysites/Monophysites. Nevertheless, Theodoret of Cyrus didn't really like anybody in this debate. Not only was his arch-enemy St. Cyril of Alexandria, he also despised Nestorius and did not enter into communion with John of Antioch, who was the Patriarch of Antioch and friend of Nestorius, and attended the council with St. Cyril of Alexandria. He would not enter into communion with him because he perceived all of these people to be in error. So, is Theodoret a heretic? Well, Theodoret's writings on Christology were condemned by the Fifth Ecumenical Council as heretical. So, inasmuch as we can say Theodoret of Cyrus, like Origen of Alexandria, has particular works that are condemned as formally heretical. Nevertheless, Theodoret of Cyrus lived past Nestorius and St. Cyril of Alexandria. If you're ever interested, read the homily that Theodoret wrote of St. Cyril of Alexandria. If it were not, well, it is quite amusing, regardless of the fact that it's about a saint. But it's quite horrific how strong the language could be between these churchmen, between each other, and the celebration that they have at each other's deaths because they think that finally a heretic has been taken to their eternal punishment. But Theodoret of Cyrus lived long enough to see the Fourth Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon, and he was reconciled with the church, more specifically reconciled with Leo the Great. In fact, we actually have, I believe, the letter of Leo the Great to Theodoret. And so Theodoret dies within the bosom of the church, recanting his errors. Obviously, he's not going to cop the title saint on account of these things, but we know that he wasn't pertinacious or pernicious in his heresy. When we view his theology, therefore, we need to have a degree of caution. But when we read his history, we can afford ourselves a greater level of trust. Theodoret of Cyrus, as an ecclesiastical writer, is somebody who we can have high levels of confidence, at least from my observation of what the academic literature says of his type of writing. When it comes to the other ecclesiastical historians like Saint Eusebius, of Caesarea and Sozomen, I think that from my own reading at least, a lot of academics tend to put more weight in Theodoret's competing accounts than those other two individuals. And so he's testifying to these things personally, and so on account of that, we have personal eyewitness testimony, or at least corroborated evidence of witnessed accounts. So, it is from Theodoret of Cyrus that we arrive at the account of St Maroun. Now, halfway or so through the book, we arrive at a rather short chapter in the religious history, only about a page and a half. And in it is recounted the life of St Maroun, one of the most well-known saints today, simply on account of the Maronite people. Now, for someone so prominent, it's rather odd that so little is said about him. But we're going to see why that's the case. It's not really that surprising when we look at Theodoret's intent, which is something that is often omitted. But before we get there, let's talk about St Maroun a little bit. St Maroun, according to most historians, was born in the city of Cyrrhus. He died in the year 410, though I've even heard some Maronite historians put as late as 423, possibly. He's buried in Barad, Syria. Now, he most famously popularized open-air asceticism. He was a disciple of St. Sabinus, and he had numerous other disciples whom we're going to discuss. But before I expand on St. Maroun, his account is so short that it's worth reading, and it's worth reading out loud. I'm not going to do this for any of the other saints because I think it would drag this talk out a bit too much. But when it comes to St. Maroun, given the prominence of this saint, especially if you're a Maronite, at least you can leave this video or talk having heard the full account of what we have of St. Maroun. This is all that history leaves us. I shall now recall Maroun, for he too adorned the godly choir of the saints. Embracing the open-air life, he repaired to a hilltop formerly honored by the impious. Consecrating to God the precinct of demons on it, he lived there, pitching a small tent which he seldom used. He practiced not only the usual labors, but devised others as well, heaping up the wealth of philosophy. The umpire measured out grace according to his labors. So the munificent one gave in abundance the gift of healing, with the result that his fame circulated everywhere, attracted everyone from every site, and taught by experience the truth of the report. One could see fevers quenched by the dew of his blessing, shivering quieted, demons put to flight, and varied diseases of every kind cured by a single remedy. The progeny of physicians apply to each disease the appropriate remedy, but the prayer of the saint is a common antidote for every distress. He cured not only the infirmities of the body, but applied suitable treatment to souls as well, healing this man's greed and that man's anger, to this man supplying teaching in self-control, and to that providing lessons in justice, correcting this man's intemperance, and shaking up another man's sloth. Applying this mode of cultivation, he produced many plants of philosophy, and it was he who planted for God the garden that now flourishes in the region of Cyrrhus. A product of his planting was the great James, to whom one could reasonably apply the prophetic utterance, "The righteous will flower as the palm tree and be multiplied like the cedar of Lebanon," and also all the others whom, with God's help, I shall recall individually. Attending in this way to the divine cultivation and treating souls and body alike, he himself underwent a short illness so that we might learn the weakness of nature and the manliness of resolution, and departed from life. A bitter war over his body arose between his neighbors. One of the adjacent villages that was well populated came out in mass, drove off the others, and seized this thrice desired treasure. Building a great shrine, they reap benefit therefrom even to this day, honoring this victor with a public festival. We ourselves reap his blessing even at a distance, for sufficient for us instead of his tomb is his memory. That is all we have of St Maroun of Cyrrhus, the great saint after whom the Maronites are named. Now, that's not that much. It's not even that much compared to other saints mentioned in Theodoret's accounts. But it might be good for us to recap a little bit. Let's go over this. St Maroun, according to Theodoret, embraced the open-air life by repairing to a hilltop formerly honored by the impious. So in other words, St Maroun lived in the open air. So that was his form of asceticism, being exposed to the open elements. And he did so on a hilltop that was previously a pagan temple. He consecrated to God the precinct, because it was once a pagan temple. And he had a small tent, but he barely used it. Okay? This is important because later on I'm going to contrast what is happening in Syria with the style of monasticism in Egypt. Now here we mentioned the umpire, which is a term referred to God. And so one of the gifts that God gave St Maroun was the gift of healing. But Theodoret says not only of the body, but of souls as well, which is interesting. Theodoret indicates that through his counsel, people were able to overcome long-term vices. He also attributes to him the cause who planted the garden that now flourishes in Cyrrhus. When he died, there was a bitter war that arose over his body. Okay, at this time, having a body in your village in Antioch was a rather sought after thing. And so various villages actually had a physical confrontation over keeping his body. And one larger than average village came through, snatched the body, and went away. And that is Theodoret's account. So is that it? Is that all we have of St Maroun? Well, I mean, there's a lot more there than what I at least will testify as a Maronite I ever really heard of. I'd never heard of St Maroun as a healer of both bodies and of souls. I never conceived of St Maroun as this open-air ascetic. Though, reflecting back now, it probably explains why all the images, or most of the images of St Maroun, are of him in the fields. But then again, most monks work in the fields, so you're not going to presume that that means that they don't have a cell. Regardless, there is more there than I would say that is conscious in the consciousness of most Maronites. Now, famously, there is one other historical document which most people are going to affirm. I've never seen anyone argue against it. I've seen it made as a more or less sure claim that St. John Chrysostom wrote a letter to an Antiochian monk called Maroun. And most people attribute this to St. Maroun of Cyrrhus. Now, this letter is, to Maroun, the monk priest, which does give us information that St Maroun was a priest, and many depictions of St Maroun incorporate him wearing a stole. So there is that. So maybe that is a bit of an extra piece of information. But beyond that, most of the letter is just speaking of the affection they have for each other, wishing each other well, hearing that the other is well and assuring them that they themselves are well, and asking for prayers. If you want, you can simply type up the letter. You'll be able to find the letter. It's rather short, but not worth me reading out. There is one other point, though, I think that is worth adding, which is, and because the fact that St. John Chrysostom wrote a letter to St. Maroun is a pretty common known fact among Maronites. As a bit of a piece of trivia that's a bit interesting, like a clash of worlds. Wow, look, the most famous Archbishop of Constantinople was also friends with the patron of the Maronites. And I used to think, oh, that's pretty cool, but why would that be the case? Like, why is the Patriarch of Constantinople, or Archbishop at the time, of Constantinople, writing a letter to some random monk in Antioch? Well, that's because St. John Chrysostom was a monk priest of the Diocese of Antioch. He was actually ordained a deacon by St. Meletius, and he was then ordained a priest by the faction of Paulinus during the Meletian Schism. And St. John Chrysostom wrote his most famous homilies when he was Antiochian, preached his most famous homilies in Antioch before going and then taking up the nomination and election to become the Archbishop of Constantinople. But going back to this map, it's not surprising, seeing how close Antioch and Cyrrhus was, for us to realize, okay, well, if John Chrysostom was a priest in Antioch, it's not that unreasonable at all, actually, for him to know of the most famous monk in Cyrrhus. And very likely they could have even met. I mean, John Chrysostom would have had to go to St Maroun in that dynamic, but it's not implausible. At least what we know is that there was enough geographical proximity with each other for there to be an established connection, so that when John Chrysostom ends up in exile and is in need of prayers, it's not surprising that somebody he's going to reach out to is this prominent monk who he knew of, who lived in Cyrrhus. So that's kind of what we can extract directly out of St Maroun. And if you pick up a solid Maronite history book, it's going to take you about this far. Okay, it's going to introduce to you the excerpt in its entirety, hopefully, but often not, just parts of Theodoret's account of St Maroun's life. There's going to be mention of the letter between John Chrysostom, and that's about it. And it's about a couple of pages worth of an introduction before we just jump right into further Maronite history. And I don't know why we haven't, at least in our own literature, taken a moment to stop and to look at the other information we have here. See, not only do we have so much more information about St. Maroun's disciples and St. Maroun's spiritual father, that information gives us direct access into the person of St. Maroun, which is something that I'm going to expound on in myself. So all of these characters, all of these saints that are going to be brought up are also in Theodoret's Religious History, chapter 16. You can find an excerpt, it's really a book, of this chapter published by Cistercian Publications. You can buy this off Amazon. It's called A History of the Monks of Syria by Theodoret of Cyrus. And it's an excellent work. It's a great read. It's like reading Lives and Sayings of the Desert Fathers, but a bit more biographical. And obviously the difference in Syrian and Egyptian expressions of monasticism in the early stages and its development. So who can we go to next? Well, I mentioned that St. Maroun had a spiritual father, and that spiritual father was St. Zabinus. Now, St. Zabinus was another hermit. See, St. Maroun was a hermit. He was an ascetic who lived more or less on his own. He did not live in the compounds of a monastery, sharing a rule of life with others. there was another hermit called St Sabinus, and he was a hermit near Sitica, okay, in the region of Cyrrhus, okay, so operating again in that region of Cyrrhus, North Syria. Now, he is recounted of by Theodoret as somebody who has already passed away, and St Maroun outlived him. Okay, so he died before St Maroun. Theodoret recounts of St Sabinus a particularly interesting practice. He says, adorned with hospitality in addition to other good qualities, he told many of those who came to see him to stay till evening, but they, in dread of his all-night standing, would allege lack of leisure and so release themselves from these labors. So there, we are introduced to this very interesting practice by St. Sabinus, that during the evening, in the outdoor, he would simply stand all night. From sunset to sunrise, St. Sabinus practiced what is called the practice of perpetual standing. Now, St. Maroun loved St. Sabinus. Theodoret actually recounts that he wanted to share a grave with St. Sabinus. That's how close St. Maroun was to St. Sabinus. Unfortunately, as we heard earlier, St. Maroun's body was snatched at his death and put inside a shrine to be venerated. And so they were never able to share a tomb together. Nevertheless, St. Maroun would visit St. Sabinus and ask for his blessings often, and considered him a teacher and a model for virtue. He encouraged every single person who visited him to go and see St. Sabinus. St. Sabinus was commended because as he grew older, he would never stop his practice of all-night perpetual standing. He never wavered on it. He introduced staff as assistants, but he did not stop the practice even into older ages. Theodoret actually asked 2 young monks to accompany St. Sabinus, but both of those monks tried to flee on account of the fact that they could not keep up with St. Sabinus's ascetical practices. They were too embarrassed that this old man is able to stand all night, and they could not do it. And when Theodoret challenged him on this and said, hey, what are you doing, St. Sabinus? What are you doing, Sabinus? These are young monks. Why are you putting this much pressure on them to follow these ascetical disciplines? Sabinus said, no, I did not force them to do anything. I insisted that they sit down. Sabinus never forced these monks to follow what he did. But again, the humiliation of young monks not even being able to do what this old man could manage was a bit too much for them. But it's a great testimony, and it's astonishing how physically strong St. Sabinus was. Not from the perspective of, he had a strong masculine body, but the subjugation of the body spiritually that allowed him to persevere with this weak and frail old body. The neighboring inhabitants venerated St. Sabinus, and they sought a great deal of his assistance and intercession in his lifetime. St. Sabinus, therefore, appears to be a source of inspiration for St. Maroun's outdoor living, even though Theodoret says that it was St. Maroun who popularized asceticism and open-air asceticism in Cyrrhus. What we see is that it existed at least before St. Maroun's time. Okay, it might not have been a particular point of charism, but we see that when St. Sabinus was practicing his ascetical disciplines of standing, he did so in the open air. The next monk, hermit that we're going to discuss is the famous Saint Jacob/James of Cyrrhus. It should be noted that older translations of the word Jacobus into English is going to translate them as James. We see this often with St. Jacob of Sorug, who in older writings was referred to as St. James of Sorug. So many older writings are going to refer to him as St. James of Cyrrhus, St. Maroun's greatest disciple. But I will more often or not, may interchange, but more often than not refer to him as St. Jacob. St. Jacob was the most famous of the ascetics in the region of Cyrrhus during Theodoret's lifetime. Actually, St. Jacob continues to live for a good decade or two after this book is written. So St. Jacob is one of these saints that are still living during the time of Theodoret's writings. And he remains the most prominent of St. Maroun's disciples still alive. And a great source of information about St. Maroun to Theodoret. And that's very important. St. Jacob of Cyrrhus was the first companion of St. Maroun, his first disciple. And he lived briefly as a recluse and then, practiced his life as an open-air ascetic. We just heard, in relation to St. Maroun's own description, let me recount this part of Theodoret speaking about St. Maroun. A product of his planting was the great James, to whom one could reasonably apply the prophetic utterance, "The righteous man will flower as the palm tree and be multiplied like the cedar of Lebanon." Now, it's rather interesting. It's rather interesting that when speaking of St. Maroun, Theodoret attributes to St. Maroun as one of the greatest achievements is the fact that he was the spiritual father of St. Jacob of Cyrrhus. I mentioned that when we spoke about St. Maroun, only about 1.5 pages of your normal sized novel or book is attributed to St. Maroun. St. Jacob nearly has 10 times that. It's more like 10 to 12 pages attributed just about the life of St. Jacob of Cyrrhus. Theodoret of Cyrrhus was quite a good friend of St. Jacob. St. Jacob had great influence, not just in his asceticism, but we're going to see in his influence in theology and his influence in ecclesiastical disputes. So Jacob lived with St. Maroun during the 390s alongside St. Maroun's other disciple, St. Limnius. Theodoret says of St. Jacob that he was a companion of the great Maroun and a recipient of his divine teaching. He eclipsed his teacher by greater labors. That's astonishing. The great St. Maroun was eclipsed by St. Jacob. And he goes on to explain why. He says, "For Maroun had a precinct of the ancient imposture as enclosure, pitched a tent of hairy skins and used this to ward off the assaults of rain and snow. But this man," referring to Jacob, "bidding farewell to these things, tent and hut and enclosure, has the sky for roof and lets in all contrasting assaults of the air. And he is now inundated by torrential rain, now frozen by frost and snow, and at other times burnt and consumed by the rays of the sun, and exercises endurance over everything." So Theodoret is saying St. Maroun practiced open-air asceticism, but he had a tent for when things got really bad. St. Jacob outdid St. Maroun because he had no tent. There was no backup. St. Jacob was always exposed to the elements. This is going to provide a really important insight into St. Maroun. See, this is the most likely reason as to why so little is written about St. Maroun. Theodoret considers Jacob of Cyrrhus to be in the likeness of Maroun, but greater. And so when recounting St. Maroun, he doesn't feel the need to expound heavily on him because he's geared to just about to expand on the life of St. Jacob. In other words, through St. Jacob, we learn about St. Maroun. In this case, I like to say that St. Jacob of Cyrrhus is to Maroun what St. John the Baptist is to the prophet Elijah. St. John the Baptist came in the spirit of Elijah. By looking upon Elijah, you understand John the Baptist. And by looking at John the Baptist, you understand Elijah. And so likewise, in this relationship between St Maroun and St Jacob of Cyrrhus, I see a likeness that exists there. It should be, in my opinion, one of the most important things that every Maronite should read. That is the life of St Jacob of Cyrrhus. It's really quite unfortunate how little devotion to St Jacob exists. I have searched and I have not found an icon or an image, nor have I found a feast day in our own liturgical calendar that refers to what Theodoret of Cyrus refers to as St Maroun's greatest disciple. You would think that his greatest disciple would be a prominent saint in the Maronite Church. But again, I haven't even heard of a parish named after the great St. Jacob of Cyrrhus. Nevertheless, Jacob becomes an additional source of information of St. Maroun. He lived like St. Maroun. He practiced disciplines like St. Maroun. And it explains to us why we have so little of St. Maroun. So it's a surprise, considering that this is not a unique point that I've arrived at. It's actually written within the critical edition of Theodoret's writing, noted upon by R. Price, that this is very likely the reason why so little is said about St. Maroun. So I think as Maronites, we really need to encourage awareness of the life of St. Jacob, just so that we can understand our own patron better. Now, let's actually discuss the life of St. Jacob of Cyrrhus a little bit. We are introduced to St. Jacob with the first anecdote from memory of him being severely ill and laying on the ground under scorching heat. Theodoret describes that various men from various villages have already came out and gathered around him, almost like vultures around a rotting corpse, so that they could take his body for their village. They're waiting for him to die. They're waiting for him to die. And Theodoret arrives on the scene, and he is aware of why St. Jacob is dying. It's clear to Theodoret that the reason this is the case is because St. Jacob is excessive in his spiritual asceticism. In other words, he recognizes that St. Jacob is effectively killing himself through his own ascetic disciplines. And so Theodoret comes up with a plan. The first part of the plan is to vacate everybody who is surrounding Jacob of Cyrrhus. And so he does this by, according to him, sending them away with his episcopal authority. And so he uses that term specifically. As a bishop, he says, I sent them away with my episcopal authority. And it's interesting because obviously this is written in the 5th century, that you have this clear testimony of a bishop saying and using what he considers episcopal authority over members of his own diocese. And you know what? They listen to him. They recognize this episcopal authority and they vacate and leave them. And so Theodoret then, trying to come up with a way for St. Jacob to lay down in shade, starts to complain to Jacob about the heat of the sun, which prompts Jacob, at Theodoret's asking, to make him a tent. So he gets up and he grabs some sticks and he puts them into the ground, and he spreads some animal skins over those sticks to create like a makeshift small tent. But Theodoret refused to sit under it unless St. Jacob sat under it too. He said, you're an older man than I am. I'm not sitting down if you're not sitting down. And so St. Jacob relented on account of hospitality to his own bishop. And then he tries to get Jacob to lay down. And so he uses the same excuse. He says, I want to lay down, but I can't lay down if you're not laying down. And so St. Jacob relents and he lays down. And when Theodoret was trying to ease the pain off Jacob's back, he noticed, he came to realize that underneath Jacob's tunic cloth that he had in his shirt, he wore animal skins, that there were large iron chains in the shape of an axe across his back and his front side. And so as this hidden, unseen ascetical discipline, almost like what you see later on with some saints with a hair shirt, St. Jacob is wearing large iron chains to weigh his body down and add extra penance to his normal ascetical labors. And, remarkably, St. Jacob gets better rather quickly as well. He seems to just hop back up, and not immediately, but after some time of rest, which Theodoret ensures, Jacob recovers to full health and then proceeds to live for another couple of decades. And so we see there that Theodoret is doing what a good bishop should do. I mean, that's what Dionysius the Areopagite says about what a bishop does. A bishop perfects the perfect. So one of the primary roles of a bishop is the sanctity of his religious, his monks under him. And so Theodoret was very intimately involved in the lives of his religious and corrected their excesses. And so in this case, where Theodoret is observing that one of these monks is killing himself because of their excessive ascetical disciplines, he's there to rein that back and to pull him into line. Another prominent story that we can speak of when it comes to St. Jacob of Cyrrhus is an incident relating to a dead child. See, it wasn't an uncommon feature in Theodoret's religious histories of infertile married couples going to monks and asking them to pray so that they can conceive. This is still a feature in our church today. I mean, many people go to religious, go on pilgrimage, go to hermits to ask them to pray so that they can conceive a child. And in fact, that's exactly what happened to Theodoret himself. Theodoret relates, I believe it was of St. Peter the Galatian, that his mother went to St. Peter the Galatian on behalf of her distressed husband. She didn't seem too disturbed so much that she couldn't have kids, but her husband was. And one of the things is that when you go to them, you ask you ask so that you can conceive a child, and normally this child was dedicated to God and eventually became some type of religious. And that's exactly what was asked of Theodoret, and Theodoret himself lived his life as a monk and then a bishop. And so likewise, a father who had difficulty with his children surviving the first few years of their life approached St. Jacob and asked him for his prayers and said, I can't recall if it was at the request of Jacob or if it was at the offer of the father. He promised that the child would be dedicated to God. Now, this man had neglected to do it, and the child had lived for 4 years and then passed away. And the father wasn't present when that happened. He was out. So when he returned home, he saw his child being carried out to be buried. Now, almost hysterically, the immediate response of this man was to take the body of his child and to rush over to St. Jacob. And he thought to himself, I failed to fulfill my promise while my child was alive, so I'm going to do that while my child has passed away. And so he put the child in front of the feet of St. Jacob, and St. Jacob prayed over the child, prayed for the child, and then had a total recovery to life. So this was not a very ill child. This was a child who had died. And St. Jacob rose the kid from the dead. Now, raising people from the dead is not small tier saint stuff. This is as big as they come. Not many people rose people from the dead. St. Elijah did. Our Lord did with Lazarus. Our Lord one-upped it and did it to himself as well. And you get some, I think St. Vincent Ferrer is accredited for that. But again, for a saint who doesn't have an icon, doesn't have an image, doesn't have a church, doesn't have a feast day, but is referred to as the greatest disciple of St Maroun, raising people from the dead, he is inconspicuously unheard of. Another factor, and Theodoret in relation to this story testifies to it and says, I spoke to Jacob and Jacob told me it happened. I spoke to the father, I spoke to the child. So Theodoret himself knew everyone that was relevant to this story. Theodoret had a great devotion to John the Baptist. Sorry, not Theodoret. St. Jacob of Cyrrhus had a great devotion to John the Baptist and even had visions of him. There's actually one interesting story where the relics of John the Baptist are being brought into Antioch. Okay, it's a massive parade. Everyone's coming out, they're cheering, they're celebrating. The body of John the Baptist has been brought here. And the hermit, Jacob, was standing there and looking from a distance, and he thought to himself, now remember, he has a big devotion to St. John the Baptist. He thought to himself, how do these people know that this is John the Baptist and not some other saint, not some other holy martyr who was killed? And later that evening, when he went back to his hilltop, St. John the Baptist appeared to him and said, and basically challenged him. He said, why didn't you venerate me? And Jacob was a little bit distressed by this. I mean, I think he actually begged Theodoret. That was the one thing he wanted, was to see those relics. I mean, he's the great John the Baptist, the greatest saint outside of the Holy Family, is preceded in, and he just didn't venerate him because he had doubts. And John the Baptist came to say to him, why did you have doubts for? What was your skepticism based off? And Jacob just longed to be able to venerate those relics again. Towards the end of this chapter, one of the things that Theodoret is continuously reiterating is the spiritual assistance Jacob gave him in his campaign against the Marcionites. See, Theodoret wasn't, Theodoret lived his life trying basically to combat what he saw as heresy. And when it came to St. Cyril of Alexandria, I mean, there was a bit of a blunder, to say the least. But when it came to the Marcionites, he was spot on. And he actually attributes to his ability to defeat the Marcionites to Jacob. Even further, St. Jacob had such prominence throughout the region that his own testimony and his own, being on his side effectively carried so much weight that it helped Theodoret secure particular tax remissions that he was seeking for his own city from the imperial court. And later, towards the end, we'll even discuss the significance of St. Jacob alongside St. Baradatus, St. Maroun's other disciple, who I'm about to discuss, and St. Simeon the Stylite in their involvement during the Chalcedonian controversy. We're going to see how valued and prominent these three monks, two of whom are St. Maroun's disciples, were in not just in their asceticism and their disposition, but in their life as theologians. Now, the next saint is St. Baradatus. Now, St. Baradatus was another disciple, another hermit. See, all of St. Maroun's disciples, at least his male ones, were hermits. Now, he began by living in a cell, and then he decided to move into a chest. Now, there is something interesting about this chest. The quote, according to Theodoret, is that from there repairing to the ridge situated above, and constructing out of wood a small chest that did not even match his body, in this he dwelt, obliged to stoop the whole time, for its length was not equal in size to the height of his body. It was not even fitted together with planks, but had openings like a lattice, and was similar to windows that have rather broad openings for the light. Because of this, he was neither safe from the assault of the rain, nor free from the flames of the sun, but endured both of them like the other open-air ascetics, whom he surpassed only in the labor of reclusion. So it's very interesting here, because Theodoret is going to say Baradatus, like St. Maroun and St. Jacob of Cyrrhus, engaged in open-air asceticism. But he added a twist, and we're going to see this from now on. Every other one of St Maroun's disciples engages in open-air asceticism, but with a twist. And St Baradatus' twist is this peculiar chest that he created, which was still exposed. It was too small for him, so he was always crouched and uncomfortable, and it was just completely exposed to the elements. So he would still, like Theodoret said of St. Jacob, be exposed to the freezing cold and to the burning sun. But on top of that, he would be crouched and uncomfortable. Now, this didn't last his whole life, because Bishop Theodoret of Antioch, when he saw him do this, wasn't too pleased and wasn't too impressed either. He kind of saw him and thought, yeah, this isn't happening. And he convinced Baradatus to stop with the whole chest arrangement. And so Baradatus got out and then simply, according to Theodoret, decided he wanted to practice perpetual standing. So he simply remained standing as his ascetical discipline till the day he died. Okay, and Theodoret says this: however, he stands all the time, stretching out his hands and hymning the God of the universe, and covering the entire body with a tunic of skins. Only round the nose and mouth he left a small opening for breath, in order to receive and inhale the common air, since otherwise human nature cannot live. So could you imagine some Levantine Christian covered in animal hair, tunics of skins, all over his body, every part of his body, including his head, with only holes for the eyes and the mouth and the nose, sitting in a chest dangling on the edge of a ridge. And that was the form of asceticism of St. Baradatus. Theodoret makes another interesting point, which is the last point relating to St. Baradatus. The stories of each saint begin to decrease from here on out. And it's basically this. He says that St. Baradatus was so well posed at posing philosophical questions and answering them through syllogistic reasoning that he compared him to be a greater thinker than those who studied Aristotle. And there's a few things to point out here, because normally people are going to say that, and normally in the early church, Plato was the well-read philosopher of that era. Most of the early fathers were Platonic. Aristotelian philosophical frameworks that underpin theology, which is also known as scholasticism. That's what scholasticism is. It's engaging in theological questions using didactic, syllogistic reasoning from Aristotelian principles. And so Aristotle kind of comes in towards the beginning of the second millennia. And we do, John Damascus does, I believe, in his famous work on the Fount of Knowledge, work of Aristotelian logic. So I guess it's maybe not that late, but normally you don't hear of Aristotle brought up this early on in church writings, but it's quite interesting that St. Baradatus' philosophical intuition and reasoning was compared with that of Aristotle and his followers. Now, I consider this an important point because many individuals have this idea that Eastern saints are really mystical and Western saints are overly analytical and scholastic. And this can bring about some problematic ideas where people start to then, at least in the East, see any form of articulate analytical philosophy as being somehow inherently non-Eastern. And so when you have someone as proximate to St Maroun as St Baradatus, his own disciple, who is being compared with his syllogistic reasoning, which is, applying philosophical logic to answering theology questions. And Theodoret is so amazed by it that he's saying he's better than Aristotle's own followers. Then to me, that's a great testimony and proof that even among St Maroun's own disciples, you had analytical theological thinkers. And St Baradatus's theological reputation is what got him among the list of 3 monks, St. Simeon, St. Jacob, and St. Baradatus, of whom the Emperor Leo I wanted to ask whether or not he should accept an ecumenical council. And so I think it's a good testimony that we have so early on. One of St. Maroun's immediate disciples, who is this great theological, philosophical mind that can be a source of inspiration and devotion to all Maronites who have a love of analytical philosophy. And I think it's proof that no one should ever be going around saying things like, if you like systematic theology, then somehow you're less Maronite, as if Maronite theology is merely exclusively typological or scriptural. We have many different disciplines of theology, and we see even among St. Maroun's disciples, some of them engaging in the more analytical, technical ones. The next disciple of St. Maroun is St. Thalelius. Now, I always struggle to pronounce this man's name, but he was a hermit. He lived about 2 miles outside of the city of Garbala, okay, which is towards the coast and a bit south of Antioch. Okay, he lived in a cell, and then he decided to live in a strange contraption, some form of suspended cylinder, which is very similar to St. Baradatus's chest. Okay, so I already said this. Each one of St. Maroun's disciples did what St. Maroun did, but with a twist. Baradatus's twist was that he created this weird chest that had these open boards and everything, where he'd be assaulted by the rain and the wind and the elements. And St. Thalelius thought, you know what? I can one-up that. I'm going to do the exact same thing, but I'm going to hang it from a tree like a bird's nest. And I'm just going to sit in it all day. And so that's exactly what he did. He converted, and somehow this testimony was an effective means of converting the peasants in the district around him to Christianity. Now, he chose, again, to reside on a hill that was infested with demons. I already said that St. Maroun sought out a pagan temple on a hilltop, and we've seen that St. Jacob, St. Baradatus, St. Zabinus all lived on these elevated parts of nature, whether it's a hilltop or a ridge. So did St. Thalelius. Now, St. Thalelius wanted to one them up even more and said, you know what? You've got a pagan temple, St. Maroun. I'm going for a possessed graveyard next to a pagan temple. And this graveyard was definitely very possessed, because Theodoret says that the animals of the local peasants were dying because of, the demonic affliction that the demons afflicted on the people and on the animals. The animals were just dying, and crops and things of that sort. And St. Thalelius actually engaged with audible and even, I think, visual combat with the devils. I mean, we're always amazed by Padre Pio fighting and wrestling with the demons in his cell. St. Thalelius, St. Maroun's disciple, also wrestled with demons, visibly, audibly hearing them as he walked through the graveyard, try to attack him. And he converted the pagans around him, and most likely through his gift of healing. Another trait that he had, that St. Maroun had. He had his gift of healing, able to heal men and able to heal animals. And when they converted, he got these converts to turn the pagan temple into a church. And so we see in the early church many old churches in Rome even were once pagan temples being converted. And St. Thalelius, even though he was a hermit living in a suspended chest in a demon-infested graveyard where he was being attacked spiritually, was able, through his gift of healing, to convert the peasants around him, and they constructed a Christian church. And so it's amazing. It's amazing how, even though these were recluse hermits, they are converting souls. They are bringing people to Christ. The next saint that we're going to discuss is St. Limnius. Now, St. Limnius was another ascetic from Cyrrhus. In fact, I already brought St. Limnius up when I said that St. Jacob was the first of St. Maroun's companions, and when St. Jacob lived with St. Maroun also had as another companion St. Limnius, and he received his formation in a monastery, and then he became a disciple of St Maroun as a hermit. And then in 402, he adopted the solitary life, and he imitated St Maroun by, again, living in the open air. But like I said, every single one of St Maroun's disciples did what St Maroun did, which was open air asceticism, but with a twist. And St Limnius's twist was that he actually lived in a walled enclosure, which is interesting. The only one of St Maroun's male disciples to do this. He lived within a circular enclosure of bricks, but he had no roof. Okay, and he lived near this village known as Targala. Now, Theodoret actually knew St Limnius personally, which is why he can testify to this. And the stone walls around him had a sealed door. No one was allowed in except Theodoret. Again, like I said, a good bishop is one who takes great concern for the spiritual perfection of his monks. And Theodoret would go around converting and fighting heretics and then visiting monks. He was quite a rather active bishop. And he had this small, St. Limnius at least, had a small window where he could bless people when they wanted to visit him, but no one was allowed through that sealed door except Theodoret. Now, he was another one of St. Maroun's disciples who had the gift of healing. But more than that, he was capable of performing exorcisms. He actually was able to even heal himself once. He was bitten by a snake 10 times, simply got up, did the sign of the cross, and was healed, and just went about his day. It's just, again, something similar with what happened to St. Paul when he was on the island of Malta. He was bitten by a snake, and they were all waiting for him to die, and he just didn't die. St. Limnius, same thing. There's one more rather hilarious story about St. Limnius. This is one of my favorite stories of all of St. Maroun's disciples. I mentioned that he has this round, walled enclosure with no roof over his head, so he's still getting rained on and burnt by the sun and everything like that. And he had this small window to bless people and a sealed door. Well, he had one other idea. He thought, you know what? There are these blind beggars. They're not able to work and make money for themselves because they're blind. I'm going to get them to live next to me. And so he constructed 2 homes, one to the left and one to the right, for these blind beggars. And he insisted that whenever people came to give him food or things for help, that would go to the blind beggars for their care. But there was one more interesting thing he did with these blind beggars, is he taught them how to sing hymns and the psalms. And so throughout the day, St. Limnius, in his own individual enclosure with no roof on his head, sat between 2 other enclosures, both were full of blind beggars who couldn't see anything, and he simply got them to sing. One side, and then the other one responds, back and forth, singing hymns and psalms all day long. And so he was a bit of a choir director with these blind beggars. And so that's St. Limnius, another open-air ascetic disciple of St. Maroun. The next is St. Abraham of Cyrrhus. Now, St. Abraham of Cyrrhus is always listed and is often listed as the first and most prominent of St. Maroun's disciples among Maronite historians. Now, there is a fair reason that people assume that St. Abraham was a disciple of St. Maroun. I mean, St. Abraham, even though he's called the Apostle to Lebanon, is St. Abraham of Cyrrhus. And St. Maroun was the most prominent ascetic from Cyrrhus. We've seen that all of these other monks were at a time from Cyrrhus or lived in Cyrrhus. And so it's not surprising to us that St. Abraham could have very well likely have been a disciple of St. Maroun. Now, Theodoret says that St. Abraham was a bishop, and he's the only bishop other than St. Jacob of Nisibis, I think, who's mentioned, that gets mentioned in this. And Theodoret says that, he says this, I myself, out of admiration at the way he did not alter his mode of life when changing his position in life, and did not, as bishop, love a relaxed regime, but increased his ascetic labors, have listed him in the history of the monks, and have not separated him from the company he loved, in my desire to receive blessings from this source as well. So Theodoret's saying, look, I know he's a bishop, but he just lived the life of a bishop as a monk, that I feel like I still have to include him as a monk, because even though he went from monk to bishop, he never stopped being like a monk. And that's beautiful. But none of Abraham's life is reflective of the consistent habits of the open-air asceticism seen in others. Now, that doesn't mean he's not a disciple. It's just in Theodoret, we don't have a clear link, which means that I've included him last because it's very possible, and it is always by Maronite historians attributed that Abraham was a disciple of St Maroun. But there is no clear expressive statement. So I'm going to put him at the end, and I think he still has relevance because, I mean, you're here to learn about St Maroun, the patron of the Maronites, and here we have a saint from the village of St Maroun who's called the Apostle to Lebanon. So, I mean, he's definitely very relevant to Maronites. So who is St Abraham of Cyrrhus? He was a hermit, he was a missionary, and he was a bishop of Kar, which is in Mesopotamia. Now, what's special about him? Well, let's first talk about his ascetical labors. He did not eat bread, he did not drink water, he did not have a bed, and he did not use fire. Now, that's pretty crazy. I mean, 3 of those aren't as crazy to me as not drinking water. Never, ever heard of an early church father, ascetic, who did not drink water. And, you know, normally you can't survive with water. But he got his sources of water from his food, which was mainly lettuce and celery. He must have been eating a lot of lettuce and celery for him to stay hydrated. Either way, no bread, no water. Bread and water is one of the quintessential forms of fasting, one of the hardest forms of fasting that exists. So to go beyond that and to be even detached from bread and water is quite an ascetic achievement. He would not lay down to sleep. No bed. He would sleep on his episcopal chair. He would close his eyes for a few minutes until he got enough energy to get back up and keep on working. Okay, and all of this being said, whenever he had any guests as a bishop, he would provide them with a full banquet of food. Okay, his beautiful example of sanctity where he is practicing the ascetical disciplines according to his own personal sanctity, and he's not compelling anyone else to. In fact, he's showing the virtue of hospitality on top of the virtue of his ascetical labors. The next prominent anecdote about St. Abraham of Cyrrhus, the Apostle to Lebanon, is how he received the title Apostle to Lebanon. See, most of these saints we've been discussing so far have lived in Cyrrhus, near Antioch, which is kind of modern day, very north Syria / South Turkey. Okay, so we're quite far up and far away from Lebanon, modern day Lebanon and Mount Lebanon. And so at this time, even though Antioch was a prestigious patriarchal domain, the regions of Lebanon, Mount Lebanon, these Phoenician port cities, and especially the villages in Mount Lebanon, were still heavily unchristian pagan villages. And the first village to be converted into a Christian village was a village on Mount Lebanon. I mean, the first village on Mount Lebanon to be converted to Christianity was done so by St. Abraham of Cyrrhus. And so what he did when he was still a priest, he and his companions dressed up like merchants and walked into this village and rented a house. And over the next couple of days, they began slowly to chant the divine liturgy a little bit louder and a little bit louder. And eventually, when the villagers heard this, they freaked out. They lost it. They climbed to the top of the house. They started pouring through the roof mounds of dirt and mud and stone to just crush and kill St. Abraham and his disciples. And they almost did. They almost suffocated until they had a very sudden change of heart, the villagers, and they decide to pull St. Abraham and his disciples out of the rubble, and they say, look, sorry we tried to kill you, but you have to leave, okay? You can't stay here. And they were being asked to leave while at that moment, a set of tax collectors came into the village. And these tax collectors came to exact the tax from the village. And St. Abraham saw a moment of Christly charity and decided that he will put himself forward to pay for the entire tax of the village. Now, this was such a generous act in the eyes of these pagan villagers that they had an immediate change of heart to St. Abraham. In fact, they compelled him to become their patron of the village, and he agreed that he would do it only if they built him a church. And he took care of that church for 3 years before giving it to one of his followers and then leaving the village. But it's quite astonishing how just this one act of immense charity, and you'd ask, where would St. Abraham get this so much money from? But basically he went, according to the account, he went to basically receive this money as a loan, and then presumably him and his disciples would have continued to labor through the money they made through their labor. Obviously, they don't have many expenses as priests and religious. They paid that off. They paid that loan off for them. And so they had a massive change of heart, and they converted to Christianity and built the first Christian church on Mount Lebanon. And so that's what makes St. Abraham the apostle to Lebanon. And so that actually concludes the list of St. Maroun's male disciples. But Theodoret arrives to the end of his writings on all these ascetics. Remember, he's not bundling St. Maroun and his disciples as one group of religious. Okay, they are simply mentioned among many Syriac monks, and you can piece together that these are his disciples because Theodoret will acknowledge that this man was a disciple of the great Maroun. So, but it's not all in one order. But he arrives towards the end after dealing with more than 25 male religious from this region. He arrives to the end and he basically says, I would be remiss to finish without mentioning at least some of the women who engaged in this ascetical life. And he says, in the life of philosophy. Now, the life of philosophy, and this was mentioned in St. Maroun's account, philosophy refers to it can be referred to at times of a way of life. Okay, philosophy is not merely just about arriving at natural truths through reasoning, human reason. It's also about right living. That's why moral virtues and the consideration of ethics is always primary to any philosophical endeavor. And so, he's speaking about that there are these women, and he speaks of hundreds of women in Antioch who lived this ascetical life. And he names only three, and he singles them out, and he's rather impressed by these women because he's saying that their ascetical labors, even though they're women, it exceeds that of the men with some of the physical labors that they're doing. And he mentions three: Saints Maroun, Domina, and St Cura. And on the screen, there is a icon, and this is a Maronite icon with St Maroun in the background, I believe, and then St Maroun, St Domina, St Cura, and they're all there. Now, they're not a trio. Actually, it's a duo, and then there's one separate. St Domina, who I believe is in the middle, she is the one who lived on her own. St Maroun and Cura, they lived together in a religious community. Now, their religious community, they were two noble women from Baroa, and they founded a small convent near a city. It's very interesting. It's a different lifestyle than St. Maroun's male disciples. Now, they actually lived separate to the convent. They lived next door in a small, unroofed enclosure, very similar to what St. Limnius did, walls but no roof, again imitating St. Maroun's open-air asceticism. Okay, and they had been living this life since 398. So from when Theodoret's writing, which is definitely after 410, because it's after St. Maroun died, from then till 398. Now, they gave their window, they had a small window in their little open air enclosure, and that's how they could communicate with the religious sisters of their convent. Now, they wore these massive iron chains that weighed them down. Very similar to what we hear Theodoret observed with St. Jacob of Cyrrhus, that he found these iron chains under his clothes. Now, this makes me wonder, where did they get them from? See, St. Maroun's two female disciples and St. Jacob's greatest disciple both practiced this unique practice of wearing massive iron chains. And this is where you might ask yourself, did St. Maroun wear massive iron chains? Okay, that's possible. It's possible that they were both of these separate disciples who we don't know knew each other might have been inspired from their spiritual father, who might have done this practice in a hidden way too. Now, Saint Cura wore such heavy iron chains that she couldn't even stand up straight. That's how much it weighed. Now, Theodoret saw the iron chains in question and was commented that not even a built man would be able to lift that much iron. They wore mantles that covered their face, their neck, their chest, their hands. They were fully covered. They lived like this for 42 years. On 3 separate occasions, they fasted for 40 days straight, no food. So that's the level of physical asceticism being engaged with by St Maroun and St Cura. The next is St Domina. And St Domina was a female ascetic, okay, and she lived in the southern parts of Cyrrhus. Now, she lived on an estate of her parents. Okay, her parents were rather wealthy, and she, as a form of inheritance, had a particular allowance given to her. And the thing she asked of her parents was that she could have an enclosure on their property that she lived with by herself. And so she had very close links with her local church. She lived almost the life of like a third order, chaste virgin religious in a way. You know, living among the world. She's not in some convent, but she's practicing poverty, chastity, and obedience, and she's heavily involved with her local parish. She's going to morning prayer, she's going to evening prayer, she's going to the liturgies, and she, she had many visitors who came to her seeking her prayers, her consolation. Now, she lives, in this stream of Syriac female virgins who lived at home. And this is a feature of like the 3rd century, and this is now carrying into the 4th and even 5th century, where the virgins who still lived within the community, right? Not yet the hermits who go forth and out seeking separation. This is the evangelical councils lived in the community. She had this disposition towards sorrow. She spent her days weeping. Okay, and the money she received from her parents, she spent significant amounts on the poor. Okay, she would cover her face in the presence of guests, and so that no one knew how she looked. And she would continue to weep, and Theodoret would comment on this. He saw it himself in visiting her, just the continuous weeping. And so that's Saint Domina. And so this actually, interestingly enough, in concluding with St Maroun's female disciples, Theodoret concludes with his account of the ascetics of Syria, Antioch, in its entirety. And so now might be a good point to kind of stop and recap on a couple of fundamental points. What we've seen here among St Maroun and his disciples is a heavy emphasis on open-air asceticism, living the outdoor life, in the elements, under the rain, the burning sun, the freezing cold. Many, if not all, engaged in perpetual standing. St. Zabinus did this. St. Maroun seems to have engaged with it. And we see St. Baradatus practice it explicitly. Many of them, including St. Maroun, had the gift of healing, when St. Maroun specifically had the gift of healing people's spiritual infirmities. They engaged in extreme fasting. Even St. Maroun's female disciples, not eating for 40 days at a time on 3 separate occasions. We see St. Jacob and St. Maroun and Cura wearing heavy iron chains, something that they may have gotten from St. Maroun himself. These forms of open-air asceticism appears to have been a trend that lasted in Syria, established mostly by St. Maroun, expressed in a very flourishing way by his disciples, but it doesn't seem to have lasted many generations. We see within the lifetime of St. Jacob of Cyrrhus that a monastery is built after St. Maroun. And we already have in this time, monasteries going on. Even some of St. Maroun's disciples came from monasteries. So this monastic living, this cenobitic living, is something that is occurring. But the eremitical life, the hermit, is something that is flourishing right now in Antioch. And it's flourishing with St. Maroun and his disciples, all of whom were hermits. And these are different. There are different key key points focused right now in Syria. See, monasticism worldwide can be traced heavily to Egypt. You know, if you read the lives and sayings of the Desert Fathers by St. Palladius, what you're going to see is a heavy emphasis on cell-based living. Okay, there are hermits like the great Arsenius, but there are also many great monks living in community like Moses the Black. And there's massive focus on manual labor, basket weaving, mat weaving, living in your cell, not leaving your cell as a form of spiritual expression, like a spiritual asceticism and a form of excellence in the spiritual life. And this wasn't limited to Egypt. You know, St. Arsenius, St. John Cassian came from Rome to Egypt. And St. John Cassian brought that back into Rome. And monasticism spread through the writings of St. John Cassian, which recounted his conferences, summarized what he learned in the Egyptian desert. And that plus the rule of St. Basil the Great formed the two principal sources of writing by St. Benedict of Norcia, which becomes the exemplary form of monasticism in the West for the next millennia. The Benedictines at a time in the West were predominantly the only religious order that existed. It was the only expression of, you know, more or less, of course not strictly, the prominent, heavily prominent form of ascetical religious life that existed in the West. All of this stemmed from Egypt. But what we see happening in Syria right now, in the Syriac tradition, is this own movement, not yet heavily influenced by the Egyptian movement. Of course, the Egyptian monastic movement is going to have a massive influence on Syriac expressions of monasticism. St. Anthony the Great still remains one of the most prominent feast days in the Maronite Church. But at this time, what we see is what is more or less an isolated expression of hermetical ascetical disciplines, with St Maroun predominantly being the one who popularized it in Cyrrhus. And so there's this emphasis on open door living as opposed to cell living. There's this emphasis on the ascetical labors over the manual labor. You know, the subjugation of the body to the point where some of these people were so weak that they were, like St Jacob of Cyrrhus, lying on the ground in exhaustion. Now, obviously, we see the development of the monastic structure, even, again, in the life of St. Jacob of Cyrrhus, with the construction of St Maroun at the request of Emperor Marcian, following the Fourth Ecumenical Council at Chalcedon in the 450s. But at this stage now, in the 400s, early 400s, late 300s. I mean, I think St. Limnius began living with St. Maroun in the 392, I think it was, or 390. Can't recall what I said. But this is what is developing in the Syriac expression of monasticism in the broader Antiochian region. And this begins to manifest or express itself through another very well-known saint called Saint Simeon the Stylite. Okay, now Saint Simeon the Stylite is often attributed as a disciple of Saint Maroun. You'll hear it quite often that Saint Simeon was a disciple of Saint Maroun, and this is actually a misconception. And then most Maronite historians are going to say, no, it's another Saint Simeon / Saint Simon mentioned by Theodoret. Now, I'm of the opinion, after studying the book itself, that neither Simeon is a disciple of Saint Maroun. Most certainly not Simeon the Stylite, but even the other Saint Simeon mentioned by Theodoret. And I think that this misconception may have arisen because Saint Maroun is mentioned in the life of this other Saint Simeon, but that is only the case because Saint Maroun related to St. Jacob of Cyrrhus, who related to Theodoret, the story that was being told about St. Simon. But simply because St. Maroun related a story about another saint doesn't mean that other saint is St. Maroun's disciple. So I think there might have just been this misattribution because St. Maroun is simply mentioned in his life, therefore he's a disciple. I think he's more a companion, this other St. Simon. But the the saint I want to focus on isn't even that Saint Simon. I want to focus on Saint Simon / Saint Simeon the Stylite. Saint Simeon the Stylite is one of the most well-known Eastern monastics ever, period. He is extremely well-known among Greek and Western/Latin expressions of Christianity. And so much so that I never even knew he was a Syriac. In fact, he's so strongly claimed by the Byzantines that I just assumed that he was just, an Eastern saint. I never knew that he was an Antioch and Syriac until I really started to study these questions. Now, St. Simeon the Stylite was an open-air ascetic. It's quite interesting. Now that we've contextualized Theodoret's writings, St. Simeon the Stylite is called that because he lived on a pillar. Okay? He lived on a pillar for 37 years of his life. And that's what he's famous for doing. But what is this expression of living on a pillar? Well, we can see now, given that St. Simeon was a friend of St. Jacob of Cyrrhus and St. Benedict, that this whole open-air expression was a well-known form of asceticism in the Antiochian Syriac East at the time. And so St. Simeon isn't emerging from a bubble, okay? Theodoret has the longest and most expressive and most accurate description of St. Simeon's life. But he doesn't just come out of nowhere, okay? He comes out of a movement of open-air ascetics. And so when he goes from a monastery to living on a pillar, he would have been familiar with this practice among others. And so just like I said, every one of St. Maroun's disciples did something lived like St. Maroun, but with one thing different. Even though St. Simeon wasn't a disciple of St. Maroun, his twist on this form of open-air asceticism, which existed, broadly speaking, among the Syriacs, is to do it on a pillar. And that's what he did for 37 years. Now, Theodoret actually visited him himself, and he says that more than once he would spend 40 days without any food. Okay, this was generally his Lenten practice, eating no food. And it's funny because he says you could tell how far into the fast he was, because at the beginning he would celebrate the liturgy standing, and halfway through he'd be sitting, and by the end of it he'd be laying on the ground because he was basically dead from exhaustion. And then he would get up and eat a little bit of food and then go back to fasting at the end of the 40 days. In fact, one of the disciples or followers of Theodoret tried to count how many vows St. Simeon would do. There's this, sometimes they're called metanies, but there's this expression, many Byzantines will do it today, of piety, where before an icon or before the tabernacle, you bow with your hand extended down and your head towards your feet, and then you do the sign of the cross. And St. Simeon was doing these things over and over and over again. And Theodoret says that one of his disciples tried to count how many times he would do this, and he counted up to 1,244 before he just gave up, because it didn't look like St. Simeon was going to give up. And he actually goes on to say that St. Simeon had eaten so little and his stomach was so empty that it allowed him to bend so far down that he could touch his feet with his head. Now, he even practiced perpetual standing, and he tied his feet to the pillar and did so that he wouldn't move from the pillar, he wouldn't come down from the pillar. And so St. Simeon is often presented as this great example of unique Christian asceticism. And it's as if he emerges out of nowhere, just this guy who stood on a pillar. And it's so unique, it's so interesting, it always captivates people's attention. But when we actually look at his life, he is practicing a form of open-air asceticism and perpetual standing, but his twist was that he did it on a pillar. And who popularized open-air asceticism? St. Maroun. St. Simeon lived in the generation of St. Maroun's disciples. He was a companion and a contemporary of St Maroun's disciples. And so what we see here is this famous Syriac father, St Simeon the Stylite, who was so famous that Theodoret said that in his own lifetime, people in Rome had statues and images of their workshops of him while he was still alive as a form of asking for his intercession. That's how popular St. Simeon the Stylite was. And that's going to lead me to the next point, is it's his popularity, same with St. Jacob of Cyrrhus and same with St. Benedict, that led Emperor Leo I to reach out to him and ask him about the Council of Chalcedon. And, there's this debate between Chalcedonians and Miaphysites / Monophysites about which letters of response are authentic, because these three monks were so important that both sides of the schism wanted to claim these monks on their side, because it was a moral authority to have one of these monks on your side theologically. And so we have, what as a Catholic I'm going to say, they're forged letters by, monophysites from that era, trying to attribute to St. Simeon a rejection of the council. And you have other letters where he's approving the council. Now, obviously, the Coptics today are going to say that the ones approving the council are the forgeries. And that's a whole other debate. But we see how popular they are, that these three were even being consulted. Now, in the year 434, it was actually Jacob of Cyrrhus, including St. Simeon and St. Benedict, who pushed Theodoret of Cyrus to reconcile with John of Antioch and end hostilities with Cyril of Alexandria. That's how influential they were. They were putting an end to disagreements between patriarchs and bishops. Okay, remember, John of Antioch was the patriarch of Antioch. Theodoret was one of his bishops, and he wouldn't be in communion with him because of John of Antioch's association and being in the middle of St. Cyril and Nestorius, both of whom Theodoret didn't like. Okay, and yes, it was in 457 that what I was referring to, this letter by Emperor Leo I regarding Chalcedon. St. Simeon was brought in on doctrinal disputes multiple times in his life. In 432, Theodosius II got Simeon to press John of Antioch to be reconciled with Cyril of Alexandria. In 434, Titus got Simeon to reconcile with Theodoret, with John of Antioch, like I just said before. And so we see this heavy influence theologically and involving the church disputes of these Syriac monastics. These were not just random monks living on the hills that no one knew of. They were some of the most prominent figures in this time. Now, having looked across all of these figures, where do we arrive at the end? We've spoken of St Maroun's disciples exhibiting particular traits. And I think that this legacy is continued. And if you want to learn more about this, watch the talk I gave about the Maronite Church's history from Peter to John Maroun. And this will explain how we go from Chalcedon to the formation of the Maronite Church. But eventually, the legacy of St Maroun in St. Jacob of Cyrrhus' lifetime is continued by the building of a monastery by Emperor Marcian to defend the Chalcedonian definition. And these monks, this legacy of Syriac monasticism continues with St Maroun, this monastery of St Maroun, being the preeminent monastery in the rural Syriac region of monasteries. And they're martyred for Chalcedon, the 350 Chalcedonian martyrs, and they persevere. But this expression is continued in Syriac Christianity today. I mean, St. Benedict himself speaks of the two good forms of monks as being the Cenobites and the Hermits. The monks who live in community, and then the monks who are on their own in a hermitage. Now, in the West, there are different expressions of this. Many orders you join, like the Benedictines, they don't really produce hermits. Others you join with the intention of one day being a hermit. That is true. But among the Maronite Church, in our orders, there remains at a high level the hermit as the pinnacle of Christian expression. And this is synthesized and most totally complete in the great 19th century hermit of the Maronite Church, St. Charbel. And St. Charbel was canonized by St. Paul VI and has ever increasingly grown in devotion within the Maronite Church to become arguably, if not clearly in my mind, the most popular devotion of Maronites, and now ever increasingly popular among Catholics of the Latin Rite and of other Eastern rites. And this expression of hermetical asceticism, the life of St. Charbel, is a life that didn't originate from nothing. The monks of the Kadisha Valley, the hermits of the Kadisha Valley, these men living these solitary lives, come from the seed that St Maroun planted in the garden of Cyrrhus. And that has borne much fruit, as Theodoret says, first with St Jacob of Cyrrhus, his greatest disciple, but ever since then, with every Syriac monastic who followed in the spirituality of St Maroun, living in the spirit of the hermit, if not as a hermit themselves. And so, as Maronites, our spirituality is fundamentally monastic. There is no expression of spirituality outside of the monastic conception. Now, I put up a talk recently which argues that is more or less a universal expression. And I do hold that to be true. But even more particularly for Maronites, this expression of monasticism, this spirit of the hermit, of the monk in his hermitage in the Kadisha Valley on a hilltop like St Maroun and his disciples, is what animates our spirituality, our soul, our identity, our culture, our very church itself.